In today's tutorial, we're going to be furthering the order management system by actually creating the login form, by actually creating the form classes and rendering them out in the template. We're going to be using the WTF pip extension that we're going to import into our app.py file, and then we're going to be creating some templates around the form and so forth. This is all for the order management system that I'm creating for the Packed Publishing course that I'm doing, all about microservices in Python. If you want to learn microservices, then do check that out. I'll put a link in the description below and in the cards up here. So let's go and dive straight into the code. So what we need to do, this is what we left it as. So we have this please log into the system, and then this output here of test. We can remove that for now. We don't need that at all. Let's go into app.py. We can remove this as well because we don't need that too, and we can remove that assignment as well. We're going to be using the WTF extension, the module from pip. So what we need to do is actually install this dependency. So if we go to, where is it, requirements.txt, under here what we need to do is actually require this to install it in. And the dependency that we need is Flask -WTF. Let's save this, go into the terminal, because what we need to do is rebuild our image, because the image, if I go back to the Docker file, it's running this pip install requirements file, so it will install Flask WTF when we rebuild the image. So let's go and do a docker compose and then build, whoops, like so. And that will build the app, and it will install all the dependencies that we have in that requirements file. And we can see here that we've successfully built the WT forms. Okay, so what we're going to do is just hit down on this and then press up like so. So we're just going to create the new container. We're going to remove the old one, create the new one, and so forth. And now what we can do is actually start creating our form classes that we can actually use within our templates. Now, one thing that we do have to do is we have to supply some configuration to this. At the moment, the app is just simple, just an app variable here. But what we have to do is just app.config, and we need to supply some configuration rules to allow Flask WT forms to actually work correctly. One configuration that we do definitely need to have is a key, and this is a security secret key, which should be completely different for every application. So what we need to have is a secret underscore key, like so. Let's just spell that properly. And we need to equal that to a string. Now this string, like I said, needs to be completely different for each application. I'm going to be changing this obviously when the application goes live. So right now I'm just going to have this needs to be changed. Okay. And now we can start creating our class, this form class that we're going to be using. So let's create a class. We're going to give it a class of login form. That's the name. We're going to pass in the Flask form. That is the argument that we're going to pass to this class into the constructor. Now we can actually start creating the internals of this class, the properties of this class, and actually start defining what elements are going to be used within this form class. There's only going to be a few. There's going to be the email address, there's going to be the password, and of course there's going to be the submit button as well. So we can do email because that's the email address. We can also do password, and we can also do submit, like so. So these are the three fields that we're going to have. What I'm going to do is just comment them out for now, because what we need to do is actually import some other bits and pieces around the particular fields that we need. So that's going to be a string, that's going to be a string field, that's going to be a password field, and that's going to be a submit button. So what we need to do is actually import some more bits and pieces from here, from the Flask WT forms. So what we need to do is have another from statement here. We're doing from WT forms, and we're going to import the string field, the password field, and also the submit field as well. So down here, where we're actually supplying these or creating these properties, we can now do that is equal to a string field, and that string field will have bits and pieces, or different requirements, different properties, different configuration. That's also the same with the password field. So let's just start that up. So that's password field. And also, whoops, I keep thinking this is JavaScript, and also the submit as well. So that is a submit field too. It's not JavaScript, it's not PHP, it's Python. So we can now start configuring these fields with some configuration that actually makes the particular rule sets for these things. So here we could validate, for instance, that this is an email. Here we can validate that the password is perhaps a different length of string or what have you. And here we can actually have some configuration around the submit field as well. So let's go and do these one by one. So the first argument that we can supply is a label, the label that we can say against the email, the password, and the submit field. Whoops. So what we're going to do is we're going to have email address. We're going to have password under here, and we're also going to have login, like so. Let's save that. Now, the reason why these are underscored in yellow is because of the blank lines that are required. So let's put in another blank line under there. That's sort that out, and a blank line under there, and that's sorted that out. So let's continue configuring these things. So we have email address, password, and login. Let's now go and add some validation for the email and perhaps the password as well. And the validation routines are stored again through WT forms, and we can pull them out by doing another from and then WT forms dot and then validators. We can import the data required, and we can also pass in email as well, because that will validate against an email address. So let's go and focus on the email address first, which is this one down here. The second argument that we can supply to these fields is the validators that we can supply. So what we can do here is supply a list of checkers. So the first one could be date required, and then the second one could be perhaps the email as well. And you can also add configuration to these things as well. So, you could have different types of email addresses that you're checking. But to be honest, let's just keep it nice and simple like this. You would also add validators to the password, and you would have a collection. And in that collection, you would have a data required like so. So these 4 lines of code will make up our lovely little login form that we're creating. And the way we get the login form into this controller, or passing that into the response of this and putting it into the template, is that within this login controller you would have a variable, and you would call it perhaps form, and you would equal that to login form like so. And then it's not JavaScript, sorry. And then what you would do is you would put in a form, and you would assign that to be form like so. So let's save that. So now what we're doing here is we're basically creating the login form, and we're setting that to this variable called form, and then we're passing down form to the template, which means that in the index.html file, what we can do is start rendering out that form. So what we can do is start building this form let's go and keep things nice and simple by only having a method of, say, post. Don't worry about the IDs or any other attributes at this moment. Now we can actually start filling out the body of this form. So one thing I'm going to do is put in some curly braces like so. We've supplied the form variable, and that form variable can be used to pull out the elements, the field elements of that form. So form, and let's do email, and we can pull out the label like so. We can also pull out the actual field itself by calling email as a method like so. So we're actually calling that. And of course, what we do is we can go through and put in the other two. So we have there the password and also the submit. So let's change that to be password. And that is also password. This is submit, I believe. And this is also submit. Now we can actually save. And if we refresh the page, we can see that we now have this form. It doesn't look very good at the moment, but this is what it looks like. With the login, we don't actually need to have the label. So let's go and remove that. So let's go back into the tutorial, remove the label from this, save that, go back into the browser, refresh this. I'm not going to be too worried about the actual look and feel at the moment. I just want to get things structured up. Now, going back to the app.py file, we have actually entered some validators into each of these fields. So we have data required, and we have email for the email string field, and we have data required for the password field. So what we can do is, upon request, we can actually validate that these things are correct. So before we actually go and check the user against the database that we haven't created yet, that we will be doing soon, we can actually validate that the actual request has been created in the way we want it to be. So underneath the form here in this login controller, we can actually start running these validation routines if the form has been submitted. Now, one of the first things I would do is I would have a methods argument in here. We're going to equal that to be a list where the first one is get and then the second one is post. This defines the different types of HTTP requests that are allowed into this route. So obviously we're posting the form, but obviously we need to get the form as well, because when you initially land on the form, that is a get request, and then when you submit the form, that becomes a post request. So these are the different types of HTTP requests that this route can have. Underneath this form initialization, what we can do is run a series of checks to ensure that the form has been submitted and whether or not it is valid. What we would do here is have an if statement and then form dot is submitted. Now that's going to return a Boolean, which is a true or false. It's going to be true if the form is submitted. It's going to be false if it isn't submitted. One thing you have to be careful about when you're dealing with controllers that have both get and post is how the internals of the controllers actually behave depending on those two methods of request. So for example, when we're passing in a get request, we are just initially displaying the login form. When we're posting back to the login form, we obviously want to do something with that posted information. So that is when it is submitted. So when it is submitted, what we need to do is validate that form. So let's do if and then form.validate on submit. Again, this is going to return a Boolean. So true if it is valid, false if it isn't valid. And remember that here we've got a list of validators, a list of validators for each field. So we have data required and email on the email address and data required against the password. Now, if that is true, then we need to go ahead and do another check against an external data source like a database to ensure that the users actually exist in the database against the credentials that were passed. And then if that is true, then what we would do is we would set up a session and redirect the user to a secure location in the application. Right now, though, we don't actually have a database. This is something that we are going to be setting up later on in this tutorial series. But for now, what we can do is just return some messages. So if it is valid on submit, what we can do is we can return a message variable, and we can say form is valid. And what we can also do is on the else of this if statement, we can return a message where we have form is invalid. Now, as I mentioned before, we have to be careful with the GET requests as well. So what we need to do above here is we need to have message is equal to an empty string, because when we're on a GET request, when we are just displaying the form, we don't actually have a message at all. So now we have these messages in place. Now we have the if statements. Let's just bring that down to make a little bit more leg room. What we can do is supply that variable message to the template. So let's just go and put that in here. So message is equal to message, like so. And that looks pretty good to me. I'll just double check all of this. I'm just going to capitalize that. So capital F on both of those things. So just to recap, this is just checking whether or not the form is submitted. If it is, it's then doing another if statement to check whether it is valid against the validators that we've added up here. If it isn't, then we have form is invalid. If it is, then we have form is valid. And this is where we would do the check against a database to see if the credentials are actually correct. We obviously don't need to do that when the form itself is invalid. There's no need to actually test against the database if the form itself is invalid, if the email address supplied is invalid, if the password just doesn't exist. There's no point in even attempting to touch the database in that kind of scenario. So then we return message to here, and again what we've done is we've set message to be a blank string right at the top just to support the GET request. Otherwise this would be an undefined variable, because this wouldn't be running, because on a normal GET request this wouldn't be submitted, and therefore none of these variables would be instantiated. So let's go into the template and let's go and add that message. So I'm going to do this as a strong HTML element, and let's just supply message like so. Let's save that, go back into the browser, refresh the page, and hopefully this will be displaying the particular message depending on the status of the form. So let's go ahead and refresh the page so we can see email address and password. It's exactly how it was before. The message is completely blank. So let's go and hit login with nothing, and we can see that the form is invalid. So that's how we can use the Flask WT forms to display form fields within these templates. Like I said, I haven't actually got a database running yet. This is something that we're going to be looking at later on in this tutorial series. These tutorials are going to be used to initially create the order system that is used in my course that I'm creating for Pact Publishing. That course is all about microservices in Python. So what we're doing here is we're creating a order management system, and what I'm going to be doing in that course is splitting up the system in microservices. So if you want to learn about microservices, if you want to learn about all the pros and the cons, if you want to learn about how to monitor microservices, how to design and architect microservices, and so much more, then go ahead and check out that course. I'll leave a link in the description below as well as on the end screen here. Thanks ever so much for watching. Happy coding, everyone. I'll see you again in the next one. Cheers. Bye.